This week's Parsha has a part that is very powerful and frightening indeed. It's called the Tochacha, the Words of Rebuke, in which God threatens various calamities if we don't follow his commandments and we break away from him. But in the end of this whole section, called the Tochacha, the Words of Rebuke, God says that he's not going to destroy us. And he says, I will remember my covenant with Jacob and my covenant with Isaac too. I will also remember my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. In other words, God is saying, yes, you didn't behave, you suffered, you were punished, but in the end, I will take care of you. I will save you. I will spare you in the merit of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when we read this verse, two very obvious questions arise. Number one, there's too much verbiage over here. It says, I will remember my covenant with Jacob and my covenant with Isaac too. I will also remember my covenant with Abraham. It should have just said, I will remember my covenant with Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. Why does it have to repeat, and in my covenant, several times? That's question number one, question that commentators ask. Question number two, why are the patriarchs listed in reverse order? First, it says Jacob. God will remember my covenant with Jacob. Then it says my covenant with Isaac. And then also the covenant with Abraham. Usually when we talk about the patriarchs, we refer to them in chronological order. Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. So Rashi addresses this question, and Rashi says as follows, that Jacob is enough to stand us in good stead. But if he's not enough, if he's not worthy enough, then he has Isaac with him. And if that isn't sufficient, Abraham is with him, and he is certainly worthy. So, in other words, the Torah is trying to tell us, the simple understanding of this, that what gets us out of our rut, which we call galut, exile, golus, is the power, the energy bequeathed to us by our patriarchs. And if our golus, if our exile conditions, and exile is not just geographic distance from the land of Israel, exile is a mindset, a spiritual form of degradation. If our degradation, our spiritual degradation, is of a mild nature, then Jacob is enough that he bequeaths to us, because our patriarchs are not just role models, which they are also the sources of our souls. So whatever they did empowers us. So if the galut, if the exile is mild, then we only need Jacob. If the exile is more severe, more harsh, then we need Isaac. And if it's really bad, then we need Abraham. So let's try to understand what this means and translate that into our actual life's experiences. There are three problems among many, but three very identifiable problems in terms of our spiritual existence in the period known as Golus, exile. Number one, and they correspond and correlate to the three patriarchs. Number one of the problems, the spiritual problems of exile, is that there's a lot of inconsistency. There's a lot of temporality. Nothing really endures. Nothing really lasts. Sometimes you could be inspired. You get up in the morning, you go to pray, and you're inspired. Or in any other occasion which inspires, it could be Rosh Hashanah, it could be Yom Kippur. And then a few minutes later, or maybe a few hours or a few days later, it fizzles out. And then you could reignite that spark, but it fizzles out. We're lacking consistency. We're living in a very, very shaky existence in terms of our spiritual lives. And sometimes we refer to such people as hypocrites because day one, they're inspired, day two, they're corrupt. No, it's not hypocrisy. That's being human. Being human means that we have an animal soul that covers up our godly soul. And sometimes our godly soul emerges, becomes excited, and then the animal soul covers it up and reverts to its original nature. Who deals with and who is the remedy for inconsistency? And the answer is Jacob. Jacob personified the trait of emet, of truth. And truth doesn't mean the absence of a lie. Truth, or emet at least, means something that is consistent, that never changes. Emet, we mentioned in many of our talks, based on the Jerusalem Talmud, consists of 3 letters. The first letter of the alphabet, the aleph, the middle letter, the mem, and the tuf, the final letter. Emet means something that is consistent from the beginning through the middle to the end. Jacob personified, as he's described in the Torah, Ish Tam, a sincere person, a dweller in the tents. He didn't know of anything out in the outside world that was filled with corruption and deception. And that's why his challenges came from his brother Esau and his uncle Lavan. Esau was a man of guile and deception. He deceived his father, Isaac, having his father think that he's a pious young man, but actually he was a scoundrel. Jacob's challenge was directly pitted against his personality of truth, of sincerity. Likewise, his uncle Lavan, who tricked him into marrying Leah before Rachel. Those were his challenges because that's what his life was all about. It was about sincerity, truth, consistency, and integrity. And if we're suffering from the lack of those traits, where do we get our inspiration? Where do we draw our inspiration from? Where do we get the empowerment to deal with this characteristic of exile? We get it from Jacob. But that's not the only problem in exile. It could be compounded with another problem, because at least when you're inconsistent, that means, like they say, a clock is right twice a day. At least when you are in a good spiritual mood, when you're inspired, then you're in the right place. But then there's another flaw, another lack of exile, spiritually speaking, and that is superficiality. When you don't really have depth of feeling, even when you're doing the right thing, even when you're praying, even when you're doing a mitzvah, even when you're studying Torah, you don't really penetrate beneath the surface, your own surface. There's very little depth to your connection to God and likewise to other people. You don't see the other person for whom that person really is. You don't see the inner making of that person. You judge the person based on the superficial veneer of the person. You judge and relate to Judaism based on its veneer, based on the surface. So that's much worse, because at least the person who's inconsistent, there are times when they are in the right place. But if you compound inconsistency with superficiality, then you're really hurting spiritually. And for that, you need to compound Jacob with Isaac. Isaac is known for his power of judgment. He was able to penetrate beneath the surface to see what lurks beneath the surface, good or bad. That's why he loved Esau. Esau on the surface was a corrupt person. He was an uncouth person. But he was able to see the sparks of holiness deeply embedded inside of him. Isaac was a well digger, as described in the Torah. That's also a metaphor for digging into the dirt until you find refreshing, invigorating, life-sustaining water. Isaac is able to break that superficiality so that we can see beneath the surface. And that is what gets us out of that dimension of galus, of exile. But we're still not through. There could be a third problem. The third problem is that conditions of exile, the suffering, the pain, the alienation, and all the things that bombard us with negative energy throughout our long, arduous journey through exile, what it could do to affect us is to take away our sensitivity, where we don't feel anything. We become numb. We become indifferent. We lose our ability to relate to others. We can just be self-absorbed, and we fall into a state of narcissism. How do we get out of that rut? It's not enough to have consistency. It's not enough to have depth when you are totally incapable of feeling anything. You're numb. You're paralyzed morally and spiritually and emotionally. For that, you need Abraham. Abraham personified the trait of chesed, of kindness, of love. Abraham was the most sensitive person. He was the antithesis of narcissism. His whole life was devoted to serving God and serving others. Even when he was ailing from circumcision at the age of 99, he was standing outside his tent waiting for wayfarers to come by in the heat of the day so he could offer them hospitality. He was sick, not from the circumcision, but from the inability for him to bestow kindness on others. And that's why God brought him 3 angels disguised as people so he could treat them and take care of their needs. This is the model, the paradigm, and the source of inspiration for us in exile to develop the sensitivity. Now, how do we plug into these 3 dynamics? How do we plug into the Jacob dynamic? How do we connect to our ancestor Isaac? And how do we connect to our forefather Abraham? So the verse continues, and I will remember the land. The Kabbalists tell us that the word land over here is a metaphor for King David and his descendant, the ultimate redeemer of the Jewish people and the world, known as Mashiach, who was a descendant of King David, who inherited the power, the royalty of King David plus. When we ask God to bring us redemption, which is our way of saying to God, God, exile is something that we cannot tolerate. We want to get out of exile's paralyzing indifference and desensitization that we experience. We want to get rid of the superficiality of exile. We want to get rid of the inconsistency of exile. And that will happen when Mashiach comes. So by us asking for Mashiach, it's our way of saying to God, we don't like and we will not tolerate these 3 conditions of exile. We want to tap into the energy of of Jacob first, and then Isaac as well, and then of Abraham. And God will grant our requests and bring us Mashiach and bring us the final redemption imminently.